Hey everybody, Dr. Dan here, and this is chapter 21, which is Globalization 1970 to 2000. And I can talk about this chapter because I've lived through it. So again, without getting into my age too much, this 1970 to 2000 is really like in the sweet spot of me growing up and what I've experienced. So the first thing is I want to go back to chapter 20 because in my reading notes, if you read them at all, I sort of discounted this notion of first world, second world, and third world. And so in my reading notes for chapter 21, I'm sort of reintroducing that concept because if you go through the reading in chapter 21, you really need to know what those classifications are that they talked about in chapter 20. So again, just look at my reading notes. The first world really refers, as far as the book is concerned, really refers to the U.S., Western Europe, I would argue South Korea, Australia, these liberal democracies that are really based on capitalism. And the second world, according to the book, is the USSR. I would argue China, so large parts of Asia. And again, these are not exact boundaries. These are just sort of the feel for how the textbook writers are classifying this. But the second world really refers to these countries that are maybe communist or maybe more command and control than the West. So that's what that's all about. And the third world, of course, are what the book says are less developed countries such as Africa, perhaps India. And again, one of the reasons I don't like classifications because I think they're really biased. You know, when you're looking at countries that are different than ours, often there's this motivation to classify countries, and I think it's unfair because who's to say who's most developed and who's least developed? I don't always think that's a good way to classify things when we're talking about history. But I'll leave it at that. Just go ahead and read the reading notes, and you know what I'm talking about. So the big theme for this chapter is globalization, and really globalization really explodes after 1989, but there's a really good reason for that, and I think for a lot of you that are younger, it's really hard to understand. But prior to 1989, so between 1947, 48, and 1989, we were going through something called the Cold War, and most of you probably know what the Cold War was, but in case you don't, it really was not a real war. It was really more of an ideological war. But what happens is, after World War II, there's really two main spheres of influence in the world, and they're politically motivated. So one of them is communism versus democracy or free market capitalism. So it puts countries like China, North Korea, the USSR at that time, which is a little bit different than Russia now, or a lot different. They were really communist countries where democracy was not present, and they were very authoritarian regimes. In other words, the press was under control of the government. There weren't really any free elections to speak of, and the economy was under the thumb of governments as well. So that is the communist bloc. And on the other side of the Cold War is really these first world countries, mainly Western Europe and the United States, although the United States emerged after World War II as a superpower and really dominated the world, was the number one superpower in this period of time. What happens is that after 1989, the Cold War changed. Most people would say it ended, and really in the classic sense it did, but I would say we still have a Cold War between Russia now, which is a one country of the old USSR, and the U.S. So in a way, this ideological warfare still exists, but it's not as intense as it used to be. Back in the day, prior to 1989, Europe was really split. So most of you have probably heard of East Germany. It doesn't exist anymore, but in 1989 it did. So these countries that are part of the First World now, most notably Germany, half that country was communist or under the influence and control of the USSR, and that's true of Poland at that time. Hungary, a lot of Eastern European countries were dominated by the USSR. There weren't really free elections, and the Communist Party controlled everything. So when you read through it, understand the Cold War existed, and the reason it's important to globalization is when there are two hostile factions, the West and the East. there's really not free trade because hostile factions restricted free trade. So there wasn't trade between the U.S. and China to any extent prior to the 1970s, 1980s, and the same with the Soviet Union. So after the Berlin Wall falling in 1989 is sort of symbolic of the end of the Cold War. After that happened, this idea of globalization, which is really talking about not only global trade as far as the economy and goods are concerned, but also a trade of culture. After the Cold War ends, there's really this explosion of globalization because borders are opened, there's more free trade both in goods, services, and culture between countries in the world. So know what globalization is. So that's why it's really important, and I'm going to glance at my notes for a minute, but, I didn't write down the page number. I did, 787. So page 787, there's one sentence in there near the bottom of the page that talks just briefly about the fact that the Cold War was really a barrier for true globalization and open trade. So that's what I need to say about that. The other thing to think about as you run through this, 1989 is a huge year, and I was just sort of reminded of how big 1989 was as I reread this text, because not only is that the year that the Cold War ends, but it's also the year that the World Wide Web is invented by Tim Berners-Lee. So Tim Berners-Lee is European. The internet and the World Wide Web are really two different things. The internet is really the backbone of global communications between computers and computer networks, but the World Wide Web runs on top of the internet, and it's truly the graphic interface with hyperlinks that we all use today. So the World Wide Web made it possible for normal people like you and me to use the internet. It's something that runs on top of the internet, and the whole idea of web pages, I mean, none of that existed before the invention of the World Wide Web. So I would argue, if you remember from previous chapters, you remember the Reformation, where the Catholic Church lost its exclusive power over Christianity, and you remember Gutenberg and the invention of the printing press, those two things really changed everything. And I would argue that the ending of the Cold War in 1989 and the invention of the internet in 1989 really have some rough parallels. Now, history obviously doesn't repeat itself, but this idea of an opening up of societies with a new channel of communications has a huge impact on the world. So remember 1989, invention of the World Wide Web, and the functional end of the Cold War. They're very important, and I'd like you to think about parallels, and think about whether or not it makes sense to compare 1989 to the Reformation and Gutenberg. So think about those comparisons. It's really this idea of a powerful institution or powerful institutions such as the church or such as the Communist Party losing its grip, and then also a channel of communications coming along that allows people to freely communicate. So I think that's important. So I'd like you to remember 1989 as you go through the book. 796 and 797 talk about migration. I'm recording this in January of 2019, so currently we're in the midst of a government shutdown because the President of the United States, Donald Trump, wants to build a wall. There's a lot of debate about that. That's really a migration thing, and really this fear of getting others into the country, that they're going to take away our jobs. And I'm not ever political in my class, so I'm not going to take a position on that either way. Your position is what it is, but what it's illustrative of is this idea that migration has not only increased because of technology, but it also has caused the same problems that it has always caused. So read about migration on pages 796 and 797. Make a note on the bottom of page 797, and I know this might seem trivial in a world history class, but make a note about the invention of cable television. It talks about that in 797, and it's funny because this book isn't that old, and now everyone's cutting cable, so the technology is always changing, but I think it's important. especially in our culture, because there was this change from what I'm going to call broadcasting to narrowcasting. So when I was growing up, there were three networks: ABC, NBC, CBS, and those are the only three channels you got on your TV. Everybody listened to the same stuff, the same news, the same television programs. You really didn't have a choice. So broadcasting really is illustrated by these broad networks that everyone watched. Narrowcasting, what I'm calling narrowcasting, is now we have a choice between all of these different channels or different podcasts or whatever we want. So we sort of pick and choose the news and the information we want to watch. And I think it's added to the political divide in this country, but I also think it's a seismic shift in technology that we need to pay attention to. And I think also on a global basis, again, IP broadcasting, such as the Fire Stick or Apple TV, globally has really changed things, because now we are all consuming the same information that we want. So just make a note of that. I think it's a pretty big deal. That's about it. I'm not going to make this any longer, but there's a lot in this chapter. So the end of white rule in South Africa is a really big deal. I think that was inevitable. Integrated trading networks. The way that the internet changed banking in the world, the way that goods and services are imported in and out. There's also a little thing about NAFTA in there, and pay attention to that, because you should know about NAFTA and these trade agreements and these trade networks. So look for NAFTA in the book, the North American Free Trade Agreement. It's really important between Canada, U.S., and Mexico. And that's about it for now. But keep up the good work. We only have one chapter to go. So I appreciate you getting through all of this book. And I look forward to you reading the epilogue, and we can move on with the final exam. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Be safe. Bye-bye.